In 1992, I attended the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church as a commissioner that year from what was then called the Presbytery of Memphis. And it was a very memorable experience for me in all kinds of ways. For one thing, as a commissioner, it was my first time to actually participate in the workings of the church at that highest level, an enormous privilege and honor for any Presbyterian. It was also my first and thus far only trip to the city where the assembly met that year, which was Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And rather than flying, I took the train to Milwaukee from Memphis, which was my first and thus far only trip on the train they call the City of New Orleans. For those of you who are old enough to remember one of the great American train songs. But more importantly, it was also my first real exposure to the problem that has in many respects dominated the Christian church in this country ever since, and that is the problem of sexual abuse within the church, which was, for the first time, a major topic at that assembly, a problem that was then just beginning to surface as a serious issue both in the church and in the wider society. And though certainly nowhere near the problem that it has proved to be for other Christian denominations, and generally not a problem of the sexual abuse of children, still it is clearly an issue that for too long had been swept under the rug in the Presbyterian Church, just as it had been in others. And out of an understandable desire to do something about that, to rectify that wrong, the Assembly that year set about systematically removing a number of the procedural barriers that were considered by many to have tied the hands of the church in dealing with this problem. For example, by removing the statute of limitations for the filing of charges of sexual abuse. The implication being, of course, that such legal niceties merely served to protect those who were guilty of such abuses, and anyone who suggested that perhaps the Assembly was going a little too far in removing all these procedural safeguards, such people were not very well received in the heat of the moment. Well, it being 1992, there was a great deal of talk at that assembly of that year marking the 500th anniversary of Columbus's encounter with the New World. But interestingly enough, there was no mention at all of another anniversary that the church could have marked that year, though certainly not celebrated. Because that particular year also marked the 300th anniversary of something that happened in the little town of Salem, Massachusetts, when 20 people, 14 of them women, were put to death for the crime of witchcraft. Now, for many people these days, what happened that year in Salem is thought to have been typical, emblematic of life in Puritan New England. But in actual fact, it was anything but that. In fact, nothing remotely like that ever happened anywhere else in New England in those days. And the question is really why? Why did it happen in Salem? And why didn't it happen anywhere else? Well, as you can well imagine, there are all kinds of theories to try to answer those questions. My own personal favorite is one suggested a number of years ago that the winter of 1691-92, having been a very damp year in Salem, there may have been some kind of mold that grew on their stored grain that, when consumed, had a psychotropic effect, with the result that the people in that area that year were all literally out of their minds. Obviously, a very creative theory, and the one that can be rather usefully invoked to explain all sorts of otherwise inexplicable behaviors. Must have been that mold again. A far more convincing answer, however, though one rather more mundane, is that what happened in Salem that year, and again nowhere else, was the result of a simple change that was made early on in dealing with the accusations of witchcraft in Salem. A change in the rules of evidence in terms of what could be presented in court. The change was to accept the testimony in matters of witchcraft of a single witness, as opposed to requiring two witnesses, which up till then had been the rule and which remained the rule everywhere else. And why the change? It was a change made in the heat of the moment by people concerned lest a witch escape prosecution on the basis of a mere legal technicality. A change that cost the lives of 20 innocent people, ruined the lives of many, many more, and very nearly destroyed the reputation of the Puritans as a religious movement. After that, you can be sure that no one ever calls Salem a city upon a hill for all the world to see. Now, about this time, you may be asking yourself, as no doubt you do on many Sunday mornings, why on earth is he talking about that? I mean, the trial of witches in Salem 325 years ago? What could that possibly have to do with us today? Well, the short answer of what that has to do with us is that this rule, the one requiring at least two witnesses for all such accusations, actually comes from our gospel lesson this morning, which itself was based upon a law found in the Old Testament, a law requiring that any accusation of a crime punishable by death, which included witchcraft in those days, had to be corroborated by at least two witnesses. A law, a tradition, a rule that Jesus thought so important that he made it binding upon his followers for their life together in the church. A law which, some 40 years later, when writing his gospel, Matthew also thought important enough to include in his account of the teachings of Jesus, what we know as the Gospel of Matthew. And the question is why? What is so important about this rule? And what does that have to do with us? I don't know that I can answer the question with regard to why Jesus thought this rule so important. But I do think I can with regard to Matthew and why he included it in his gospel record of what he considered to be the authoritative teachings of Jesus. Now, you have to remember when the Gospels were written and why, in order to understand the context for this and a lot of other rules. Because we're pretty sure that none of the Gospels of the New Testament were written any earlier than 30 or 40 years after the death of Jesus. And why then, you might ask? Then, because the people who had known Jesus, the people then that knew what Jesus would have done in any given situation, the people then to whom the early church looked for leadership, the people whose judgment upon matters was regarded by others as being authoritative, those people were all dying. So where was the church to look for guidance when they were gone? Well, the answer ultimately was the Gospels, the authoritative records of the teachings of Jesus, the place where you looked to find out what Jesus would have done. And when you understand why Matthew has compiled what he has, and you look at the shape of this particular passage, the rules of Jesus that he has pulled together here, you will see that Matthew's real concern here was preserving the ability of the church to speak and to act with the authority of Jesus. To put it bluntly, his concern here is with preserving the credibility of the church. And perhaps because of some personal experience in this matter, Matthew seems to have known full well that the greatest threat to the church's credibility was its getting sucked into controversies based on half-baked accusations that were little more than personal vendettas. Because if it did that, if the church took sides in a conflict on the basis of a very one-sided version of what the problem was, then it would grievously damage the church's ability to speak on this or any other matter in the future with authority. Which, of course, is exactly what happened in Salem, a perfect example of why this rule, this simple little rule requiring 2 witnesses, could be so important. And frankly, it's why it's still so important today, though perhaps not in exactly the same way as it was in the time of Jesus or Matthew, or even, for that matter, in Salem in 1692. Obviously, very few people these days are being personally accused of witchcraft, or even of much of anything else, at least not in the church, though occasionally accusations are still lodged against individuals, most of the time clergy. And there is, or there should be, some concern whether there really are sufficient safeguards to protect those who are actually innocent of such charges. But that's not the problem. The problem today takes place on another level. It's not so much a problem of personal vendettas or other such controversies, but in terms of the church dealing with the larger issues in our society, issues that in many cases are very complex, and where the church, out of an understandable concern to speak in a timely fashion to the wider society about the issues facing us, sometimes does so without really a full airing of the issues involved, without hearing from everyone who is involved, or without allowing sufficient time for a genuine consensus to form around issues within the church, the kind of agreement wherever 2 or 3 are gathered that is so important to the church's moral authority. Now, sometimes the church has done a very good job with this, and when it has, the church has been able to speak with real moral authority. But there's always the temptation, whether at the level of General Assembly or the level of the congregation, there's always the temptation to rush to judgment on a given issue, the temptation to speak before really having listened. And the danger in doing that, the danger now, just as much as it was in the time of Jesus himself, is that it destroys the ability of the church to speak with authority on all subjects. And when that happens, then no one listens to anything we have to say, which is why Matthew thought these rules were so important. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forevermore.